Today is July 2nd, 2024. My guest is neuroscientist, philosopher, and author Sam Harris. Sam is the host of Making Sense and creator of Waking Up. This is Sam's second appearance on EconTalk. He was last here in February of 2023, talking about meditation, mindfulness, and morality. Sam, welcome back to EconTalk.
Thank you, Russ. It's great to see you. Happy to be back.
Our formal topic for today is an episode you did at Making Sense on the situation on U.S. campuses. I'm sure we'll get into other things along the way. I want to warn parents listening with children, this episode may touch on adult themes or language. So let's start with the protests. Although it's funny, here we are in the end of June. Campuses are so quiet. It feels like, is that like a historical event, those encampments? And it seems like it's just ancient history, but I think we learned something important. But you could argue that they're not so significant. It was a small vocal minority, a lot of outsiders swelling the crowd. Do you find it worrisome, what we saw at the end of the school year?
Yeah, I do. I take your point that by sheer numbers and by a percentage of students on campus, the actual details might not justify too much concern, right? But the problem for me has always been that this far left moral confusion, that goes by many names. We often call it wokeness or a social justice moral panic. I mean, it's identity politics in its most strident form on the left. All of this, the reason why it's such a concern, even if it's maybe 8% of the left of center activist types, the problem is that it has captured our most elite and heretofore influential institutions, right? So we're talking not about just random colleges. We're talking about Harvard and Princeton and Yale and Stanford. I mean, just go from number 1 to number 30, and they're all captured, right? When we're talking about media, we're not talking about random blogs. We're talking about the New York Times. We're talking about just the most important properties. We're in culture. We're talking about Hollywood, from Netflix on down. It's elite institutions, and that worries me because I care about these institutions, and I think we should all care about them. It is important that the New York Times, perhaps above any other paper on earth, get its head screwed on straight, right? And so that's so there are obviously two ways of looking at this. You can always say that it's a minority, in this case of American society, which is true. If a Harris-Harvard poll done, when those protests were at their height, suggested that 75% of Americans wanted the IDF to go into Rafah. Right, 75%. Right, so we're talking about, and yet our politicians were being bent not by the 75% near consensus. They were being bent by what they were seeing on college campuses, and I think we saw support for Israel visibly erode, almost on an hourly basis from the Biden administration in response to what we were seeing on campuses.
I'm not sure how significant it is that the so-called best colleges in America saw outbreaks of protests that were not just anti-Israel, but pro-Hamas, which was kind of shocking for me. And I think you've alluded to it as well in your work. It was the response that these institutions had. Whether they're captured or not, they're slow to turn. To me, they're like large ocean liners. There's a lot of people hoping that they'll be different going forward, either because donations are down or other reasons. But it's clear that their response to this challenge was feeble. Now, you could argue it should have been feeble. You could argue, and let me make the case and let you agree or disagree. Okay, I'm living here in Israel. Of course, I think Israel has a right to exist. But suppose you do think that Israel's an oppressive, apartheid, genocidal place and country, in which case, nonviolent protesting, blocking people on campus, supporting people who have fought against Israel would be an honorable thing. And a college campus is a place for that debate to take place. And so why is it a problem that that extreme view, but defensible at some level, was tolerated?
Well, with anti-Semitism, it really always seems to come down to the double standard, right? And I think that's the thing we detected in those congressional hearings. It wasn't that you couldn't make the case for something like free speech absolutism on a college campus, wherein you could entertain any idea, no matter how apparently odious. You should be able to have a seminar on, whether we should burn people for witchcraft, right? I mean, that's that's totally fine from my point of view. But what was so obvious, glaringly so, and this is what many of us found so galling in those testimonies, is that the double standard was there and totally unacknowledged. I mean, we all knew that had the analogous protests, in their extreme, political orientation and moral obtuseness, been launched against the Black community or the trans community on any one of these campuses. If you had white supremacists, I mean, just imagine the day after Dylan Roof murders a bunch of Black parishioners in I think it was Charleston, South Carolina. Imagine you had white supremacist students at Columbia on the quad that day celebrating it as a victory for their ideology. We know exactly what would happen, right? I mean, these kids would be kicked out of school. It's so far outside the bounds of what that institution wants to be associated with that to say nothing of them actually obviously breaking the stated policies of demonstration. I mean, they're violently harassing people. You can't spit on people. You can't prevent people's movement. You can't chase people through the corridors of a building so that they barricade themselves in fear inside of a library, right? I mean, that's just not the kind of demonstration that any one of these institutions supports. And yet they did tacitly support it because they pretended to just be infinitely open-minded as to the legitimacy of this whole project. And what was so clear is that they wouldn't have been had the targets been really anyone other than the Jews, right, and Israel. And so it was that double standard that I think was just unsustainable.
And you gave the example in your episode about the Chinese, which put the Uyghurs in concentration camps. They're worthy of being protested, but the idea that a Chinese American or a Chinese national even on a college campus should be harassed for that would be unimaginable. Now, for me, the hypocrisy isn't the worst part. I mean, it's alarming as a Jew, but it's not the worst part. For me, the worst part is the toleration of physical intimidation. You gave the example of chasing people through the streets, through the corridors of a building. What we're seeing in North America right now, and to some extent in Europe, is a slow, very slow, a boiling the frog kind of slow uptick in anti-Semitic activity. It starts with slurs, yelling at people on the street, making them feel uncomfortable. And then it's an occasional, what's happened a lot in Canada over the last few weeks is the shooting out of windows in synagogues, Jewish schools, when no one's there. I mean, so it's on some level, it's just a protest. It's just a bit of vandalism in the name of a cause. And then it's, roughing somebody up on the street, but not killing them or bludgeoning them or kicking them and harming them. But my worry is that that's what will happen next. I was just in the United States for 2 weeks. People say, well, how was it? How was it? Did you feel anti-Semitism? Not at all. None. I was in New York. I was in Washington, D.C. I was in Memphis, Tennessee. I was in Huntsville, Alabama, visiting family. I didn't feel anything. I did wear a hat. I did not wear my kippah out on the street, which I've done in the past. But I didn't imagine. It really was kind of silly. There wasn't any feeling of a presence of anti-Jewish or anti-Israel sentiment. but I worry it's coming, and I'm worried that, and maybe I'm being paranoid. I don't know.
Mm. Yeah, well, I think we're wise to be alert to how this slow abridgment of liberties and the encroach of double standards just accumulates and it gets normalized. An example of this just came to mind. I was in New York recently too, and I was walking down Fifth Avenue, and I passed that great temple. I forget the name of it. Maybe it's a Temple Emmanuel, but it's on Fifth Avenue around 66th Street, somewhere around there. And I've walked past that temple many, many times in my life, and this time I noticed that there are these giant blocks of stone on the sidewalk. I mean, each block is maybe the size of a dishwasher, something like that. It probably weighs 2,000 pounds. And there's a bunch of them just ringed around the entrance to the temple. And I bet most people who walk past those blocks are not alert to their significance, right? And what is their significance? If you take 30 seconds to think about it, more or less everyone can figure out that what is intended there is to prevent someone from intentionally driving their car on the sidewalk for the purpose of murdering people who are gathered out in front of the entrance to that building, who can be safely assumed to be Jews, right? I mean, that's normal life in Manhattan, which is, has to be one of the most, one of the safest cities in the world for Jews, but there happen to be many of them there. No one else has to do that in American society. This is completely standard in Jewish culture to have a level of security, to have metal detectors in your buildings, right? That no one else does this. No one else thinks to do this, and there's a reason for it. I mean, there's for every year after September 11th, 2001 in America, even the very next year, 2002, right? Jews have been a greater target of hate crime than anyone else in American society, including Muslims, right? Including African Americans. I mean, there's barely anyone in second place, right? It's like a 5x difference in most years now. Since October 7th, it's probably a 15x difference, right? So it's and excuse me. And I was always someone who discounted the significance of this. I know the big change in me since October 7th is that I'm finally taking anti-Semitism seriously. I really felt that it was behind us in some significant sense. I mean, certainly in any in any Western city, in open societies, I just felt that there's just no reason as a Jew to worry about the significance of anti-Semitism. And the thing that October 7th changed for me and for many of us is that no safe assumption. And there is this ratchet effect that you're alluding to, where you just see this incremental change in the wrong direction, which if you are alert to the historical echoes of that, if you imagine what it was like to be a Jew in Germany in 1930, right? Things look bad, but they didn't look so bad that people packed their bags and left, right? Which obviously they should have, but it's easy to see that they couldn't see it, right? And you read these heartbreaking editorials from the time where in Jewish newspapers they would talk about how Hitler is never going to do what he says he's going to do, and there's going to be this moderating effect on society, and it was in retrospect pure delusion, but no one could imagine such a thing as possible. Well, now we should be able to imagine it because it happened, right? We know how, and it happened again not merely because there was some unique evil born in Nazi Germany in the 30s, which created this killing machine that was rolled out to the rest of Europe. That's not how the Holocaust happened. I mean, that's half of the story. We have the concentration camp system, and we had what the Nazis themselves did, both within it and outside of it, with their killing squads, the Einsatzgruppen. right? But that's 3 million of the 6 million deaths of Jews in the Holocaust, right? The rest were killed in a wide variety of other ways, and many were killed by their neighbors who were not German, right? They were Lithuanian and Latvian and Ukrainian and Polish and Croatian and even Greek, right? I mean, this is what happened, and so we know that it's possible from one day to the next as a Jew to discover that your neighbors want to kill you, right? And they want to kill you not because the Nazis came from outside and are forcing them at the point of a bayonet to kill you. No, they want to kill you all of a sudden because they realize it's possible, right? It's that no one's going to hold them accountable for it. And again, that sounds completely paranoid in the context of the life in which I've lived, which I lived prior to October 7th. But when you look at, in Los Angeles, people beating Jews up for trying to enter a synagogue just last week, in the most, in the most densely Jewish neighborhood in the city, the Fairfax area, that's not far from, I mean, that's an explicit historical echo that, we should have absolutely no patience for as a society. And as people have pointed out, we already have too much patience for it in the sense that there's no one's talking about it. If there were, this is a point that Noah Pollack made in the Free Press. If you change the complexion of that situation, if you imagine, MAGA Republicans ringing a mosque in Los Angeles and not letting Muslims enter, and then beating them up if they tried to enter their mosque in Los Angeles, we would never hear the end of this, right? This would be wall-to-wall coverage. There would be a presidential commission to investigate this. This happened to Jews 10 days ago, right? And it's completely fallen out. It's been completely memory hold. It's not totally irrational to worry about society suddenly becoming fundamentally hostile to Jews, even in the West.
I'll just add a few comments to that. You and I have corresponded via email about The World of Yesterday, which is Stefan Zweig's memoir, his autobiography. It's really remarkable. I recommend that everyone read it for 100 reasons. I mean, it's just it's a incredible garden of delight, intellectual delights. But one of the things that he writes about is the rise of the Nazis and the role that physical intimidation played, the way that a truck would pull up to a peaceful gathering and brown shirts would pour out of it and they beat up a bunch of people and get back in and go away. And the folks who were the victims, plus the bystanders, would go, well, that's too bad. That's unfortunate. It's a bad thing. Thank God they're a small minority. And their leader is an insane man who, of course, will never come to power. But there's an incredible asymmetry of influence and power when you have a group willing to use force and violence to get their way and a group that's uneasy about confronting that violence because they're civilized. Yep. So the uncivilized have a tremendous advantage there. Now, that's the bad news. The good news, as a friend of mine points out when I start getting worried about Kristallnacht, which is what Toronto feels like lately with a synagogue's windows being blown out, shot out. The police remain pretty much on the Jews' side in America. England don't look so much, but in general, the police are pretty clearly not so sympathetic to thuggery against Jews or anti-Israel or pro-Hamas protesting that turns violent. So that's somewhat comforting, but I think you have to be kind of vigilant about it from the very beginning, and how you do that, how you stand up to it. We probably mentioned this on the program before, but when people were tearing down the signs of hostages in the early days of the aftermath of October 7th and the Hamas kidnappings, I found it infuriating that people would photograph video with their phone, these people tearing them down and try to identify them and shame them, but no one tried to stop them. And then there was a viral video of a construction worker somewhere in New York, some borough of New York, I want to say Queens, I don't remember, who stood up to a guy and said, "You're not doing that." And the guy got terribly uneasy and ran away, basically. And that's no one wants to be that guy. Most people don't want to. He did, but most people don't want to be that guy. They don't want to put their body on the line. They don't want to take a group of people and say, this is our campus. We're walking across. I don't care what you say about Zionists. We're Zionists. We're Jews. We love Israel, and we belong here. You can't stop us. That just generally didn't happen, other than UCLA, where there was a physical confrontation, which I think had some complicated backstory. Anyway, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, it's obviously you take a significant risk, not just physical, but legal, whenever you engage in any kind of use of force, right? I mean, we have created a monopoly on the use of force in society for good reason, right? And when you decide to reclaim that, right for yourself, things can go haywire in lots of ways that are unintended, right? I mean, we know this from encounters where on a subway in New York not that long ago, you had a mentally ill person harassing everyone in sight, and finally some bystander who quite rationally thought he was in a position to solve this problem. I think he'd been a Marine, decided to choke this person unconscious in front of everybody, and he got help from other people. Like other people were helping him subdue this person. But, he didn't know enough to know, obviously this guy was not a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and he choked him unconscious for too long, and the guy died, right? So people are, unless this is really your wheelhouse, which is to say you're like, a highly trained, combatant of some sort, you don't know what's going to happen. If you punch someone in the face and they fall down and hit their head on a curb and die, you're probably going to prison, right? Unless you can... Yeah. Prove that you were in fear for your life imminently, and that any rational person would have been in fear for their life imminently in that moment. And that's not the usual situation you're in at a protest where you have a bunch of people with signs and bullhorns and they're shoving each other, right? If you just you shove someone too hard or you punch them in the face and you really harm them, right? The rest of your life can be spent untangling that mess at best. And so, yeah, it's restraint is to say nothing about the wisdom of de-escalating situations whenever that's possible. But it's kind of a game theoretic problem here, because it is rational for each individual to avoid violence and to avoid conflict. Right. I mean, that's just your life is better that way. It's far less unpleasant at a minimum, and you're not open to legal jeopardy, et cetera, right? So you just drive away from the protest, right, and ignore these people with signs who are not letting you get into the building you thought you were going to go into that day. I mean, just avoid the whole thing, right? But of course, that is to cede society to the thugs. Right, and if you just replace the windows of the synagogue every time someone throws a brick through it, and you do nothing else, right? Well, then maybe the problem will go away, but I think at a deeper level, we have to convince the rest of society. I mean, certainly, to speak from a Jewish point of view now, I think we have to convince the 98% of, in an American context, the 98% of American society that's not Jewish, that there's much more at stake here than just conserving the concerns of a yet another beleaguered minority, now the Jews, right? I mean, this is why I'm not especially a fan of looking at this exclusively through the lens of a rise in anti-Semitism, because I think it's a much bigger problem. This is the fate of open societies are at stake here. It's not just that there's this global rise in Jew hatred.
In your comments on the campus situation on your podcast, you made the observation somewhat similar to what you did a minute ago, but you said it more dramatically. You said, basically, Jews at some point in their history in various countries have been driven out. And certainly that includes the countries of the West, Spain, England, Germany, et cetera. And it certainly includes most of the countries in the Middle East in the aftermath of the establishment of the State of Israel, other times before that, Jews are become, after for a variety of reasons, sometimes religious, sometimes political, they become the scapegoat, they get their persona non grata, whatever the plural is, and they get driven out. And on the way, they're often killed and treated badly. So, one response to this moment, and I directed you because, I'm a so-called religious Jew, and I think you're not.
Yep.
You're a very famous non-believing Jew, a famous atheist. Wouldn't it be a better thing, rather than standing up and risking all the violence we've just been talking about? Wouldn't it be a better thing to just say, "Look, nobody likes us. Let's just stand down. Let's take off our kippot. Let's change our names. Let's mingle even better and assimilate even more. And this little country in the Middle East where we have this little tiny bit of land, true, we have this historical connection to it, but they don't like it. The Muslims don't like it. The non-Muslims rule there. It sticks in their craw theocratically. It sticks in their craw emotionally. I should just move out of here. I should leave Israel, and I should become a citizen of the world. I should become a Nova Scotian or wherever I decide to settle. And while it's true that Hitler didn't care whether you were religious or not, I think we could probably assimilate pretty effectively. And let's just stop. Let's just give up on this. I'm curious.
Well,
that doesn't appeal to me.
Yeah.
That doesn't appeal to me. I'm curious
I
why
get
it doesn't appeal to you.
Yeah. Well, it did at one point, and I could be argued back into that position again. I've said as much in the past that I thought it would be, a fitting, final chapter to all of the secular gains and secular wisdom that the religion of Judaism has produced, or the tradition of Judaism has produced, to have the Jews be the first to recognize that the end game for civilization can't be all of our separate tribal loyalties vying for dominance or inclusion, right? That we need to unravel our religious tribalism finally, and for the Jews to say, listen, we're done playing this game. We're human beings, and we have a common project, and we're not going to bang on about our the significance of our sectarian ideology anymore, much less our chosenness as a people, because we don't believe these things anymore. Humanity has got to choose itself at this point, and we're going to we're going to evaporate. We're just going to disappear into the rest of culture. I can still get behind that project. The problem is that it doesn't solve. And it would solve the problem for all the Jews, or it might well solve the problem for all the Jews that are alive, right, and their descendants, right. They'll just be people, and honestly, that's pretty much the way I've lived my life, right. So I speak as one who has a very tenuous connection to the Jewish tradition, and I was while I've gone to my share of bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs, it's not. I know what it's like to live a radically secular, deracinated life from the perspective of religion, and I recommend it. I mean, it's not without certain problems. I mean, there are things that I think we need to reinvent, and we haven't reinvented them in secular culture. But it does not have the downside that many religious people would imagine, or at least not all of the downside. But the problem is that if you just imagine what would happen if Israel, all the Jews of Israel woke up and had that epiphany tomorrow, and they said, we're out of here. We're moving to America. We're moving to Europe. We're going to take all of our wealth and our intellectual property and just have fun in New York and LA and et cetera. What happens? Well, I think in the Muslim world, you get an instance of Islamist and jihadist triumphalism of the sort that we have never seen, right? This is, yet another victory for the one true faith, and the reclaiming Jerusalem for Islam will be, a a block party of a sort that we have never seen the world over. And what will that signal to 2 billion Muslims? Will it signal that now it's time just for the lion to lay down with the lamb and we're all going to get along? No, it will signal the coming triumph of Islam, right? And so when you look at the radical core of that faith, how big that is anyone's guess, but it's not 5 million people, and it's probably not even just 50 million people. It's a very large number of people who view the course of human history as tending toward just the final triumph of Islam. This would be, data point number one that is imminent, right? That is just, it's going to be the best thing that has ever happened for jihadism and Islamism globally. And so it wouldn't solve the problem. It would just move the problem to every border of every open society, right? We would have, do you think the Charlie Hebdo cartoonists would be alive if Jerusalem had been ceded to Islam in the 1970? No, right? I mean, this is not the wind in the sails of jihadism and Islamism would be that much stronger had they won their contest over that land.
And Salman Rushdie would still sleep poorly at night. I think. So this is consistent with the view, and I want to turn to this now, that somehow Israel is on the front lines of the West, defending the West, not just itself in this current moment. We're under attack by Hamas in the West, Hezbollah in the north, the Houthis in the south, Iran in the northeast. It's a frightening moment for Israel, and our existence is actually at stake, which is, I think, unappreciated by most people, other than those who live here and some Jews who live elsewhere. But before we get to the question of whether we're a bulwark for the West and saving the West, I want to get to one small thing you mentioned that I think bears mentioning, that you mentioned in your episode, which is Qatar. You just mentioned in passing in that episode that when we think about what's going on campuses, we shouldn't miss sight of the fact that Qatar has donated, I think, billions of dollars to American campuses. And, part of me says, well, I guess, it's not unusual that people who give money want something in return. That's normal as an economist to assume that. But until I was listening to you, it never really crossed my mind, like, why is a country giving money to a university? It's such a strange thing. It's bizarre.
Well, it's not just. I mean, they give more money to American and British, Western universities than any other country on earth, right? I mean, I think they've got something like 300,000 actual citizens in Qatar, and then they have something like a million foreign workers or 2 million foreign workers. But I mean, that's just an amazing fact, and it's accomplishing something. I mean, if you're paying attention to the intellectual exports of Middle East studies departments, if you've been paying attention for the last couple of decades, you can see what it's accomplishing. I mean, there's an Islamist obscurantism that comes out of those departments that exonerates the truly peaceful religion of Islam on all counts at every opportunity, and seems to move in lockstep with organizations like the Council of American and Islamic Relations, CARE, which is a none too stealthy front group for the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, it's just there's a theological agenda clearly evident in what purports to be, on the one hand, just academic scholarship, and on the other hand, benign social activism, meant to protect a minority group in the U.S. And it's the stench of Islamism is everywhere to be seen. And by Islamism, I mean the political agenda of theocrats, essentially, within Islam.
It's also worth mentioning that Qatar is the host of the leadership of Hamas, which is one of the stranger things about this moment, that somehow we pretend Qatar belongs in, along with other nations in the civilized world. They're helping us with negotiating to try to get some of the hostages out. They are the hosts of these people's leaders. They're not objective. They have an agenda. And, they bought the World Cup, the last World Cup, and they seem to be just like a normal country, but they're not. They're a strange, they have an agenda.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's move on to the least pleasant part of this conversation, which is, I apologize I don't listen to you every week, but I listen to you occasionally, and you make me jealous. Your eloquence and clarity on many, many issues is, I think, unparalleled. And in addition to the episode on campuses that we'll put a link to, we'll put a link up to your episode, The Bright Line Between Good and Evil. And in that episode, and in the second one as well, that I mentioned, you lay out the case against radical Islam. And I have to say, it makes me uncomfortable when I hear it. It is blunt. It seems uncharitable. It is. It's really actually totally unacceptable. And when you brought it up again in the campus conversation, you said, "No, I know you're sick of hearing about this from me, but trust me, I'm even more sick of it than you are." And I'm thinking, well, that's because you're an obsessive, strange person, Sam Harris. You've got this bee in your bonnet, which has got to be the least appropriate metaphor for how frightening radical Islam is to you. And it's emotionally, even to me as a Jew living in Israel, it creeps me out. But when I heard it the first time, which no one has the courage, very few people have the courage, and alongside your intellectual vitality and credibility and care, no one else has that. No one. No, what you say is unmentionable, and I'm sure it's cost you many listeners and many friends, because you don't sugarcoat it. So I'm going to give you a chance to lay it out here, why the West is at stake here, not just Israel, because of the nature of radical Islam. Because, as you point out, it's very easy, and most people fall into this, what you would call a trap. They look at the Middle East right now, the Arab-Israeli conflict. It's a standard political fight over land, just like Ireland had it. The people, it's a zero-sum game, and it's hard. But eventually, there's a compromise, because most people want to live better lives and they want their children to live better lives. And let's stop this ridiculous posturing. And although I'd really like my narrative, I have to accept the narrative of the other. And let's sit down and live together. And I think most Israelis very much want that. I like to believe most Palestinians want that. I don't think you agree. And you certainly don't agree that many parts of the Arab world don't want that. So go at it.
Yeah. Well, I should say that there are many people, I mean, there are not enough of them, but there are many people who have quite a bit more courage than I have, in that they're making the same sounds on this topic that I make, but their lives are much more in jeopardy as a result. And these are ex-Muslims, right? I mean, so these are people who are officially considered apostates within the faith. They were born in Pakistan or in Saudi Arabia or in Gaza or wherever, and I know many of these people, and people like Yasmin Mohammed and Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and I mean, I become a Christian, but Yasmin is an atheist. But the penalty for apostasy everywhere under Islam, officially is death. Now, whether or not people, any given community wants to carry it out, and what's the fine print on that, we can argue about. I mean, but no one can tell you that you're perfectly safe in the Muslim community worldwide changing your religion. It's just because you're not, right? And there's a hadith that covers that explicitly. I just recommend to your listeners to spend some time listening to ex-Muslims, because one thing that will accomplish that I can't accomplish for you is it will cut through any intuition you might have about the role of identity and the fact that I don't have direct exposure to the culture. I'm not a native Arabic speaker. I'm not an Arabic speaker at all. I can't read the Quran in the original, therefore, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, look, just take the list of complaints you might hear from someone about why I should be disqualified as an authority on this topic. You can't do any of that with an ex-Muslim who comes from one of the relevant countries in the region, right? And Yasmin Mohammed is a great example of that. She's got her own podcast, so yeah, I mean, one irony here is that someone like me is often accused of lacking empathy for Muslims worldwide, and that my critique of Islam is coming from a place of just being dangerously detached from the lived experience of Muslims anywhere, and in my view, that gets it almost exactly backward in terms of how I actually think about this, because I perceive myself to have much more empathy for a truly committed, spiritually awake Muslim than most people, right? I mean, most people I encounter, most secular people, certainly, simply don't know what it's like to believe in God, right? They tacitly imagine, they tacitly imagine that no one really does, right? They think that everyone is bluffing, right? I've met anthropologists who focus on this terrain. I mean, someone like a Scott Atran, right? I mean, jihadism is his major area of focus. He doesn't think anyone believes in paradise, right? He thinks it's all of that's just bluffing. It's all just propaganda. What they really believe in is just the necessity of male bonding with what he calls fictive kin, right? A wider social network than is strictly predicted by the evolutionary rationale of bonding with kin. How is it that the young men form these bonds in gangs and soccer teams, et cetera, and in the case of jihadist organizations, they form bonds for which they're willing to die? Well, this has nothing to do with eschatology or a belief in prophecy or belief in the validity of specific doctrines like martyrdom and the real existence of paradise. No one believes in 72 virgins. There are most secular academics, whether they have explicitly denied the reality of all of this or not, they doubt that anyone believes these things. Now, I have no doubt that anyone believes these things. I mean, the people who claim to love death more than we love life, I think almost to a man or woman, are honestly representing their lived experience. I mean, it's an honest confession of both a worldview and of a state of mind psychologically. They don't think death is real, right? They think that you get everything you want after you die. You will be, as a martyr, you are guaranteed to be instantly whisked past this velvet rope in the sky, and you wind up in paradise with Allah, with rivers of milk and honey and 72 virgins. And what's more, you can get 70 of your nearest and dearest friends and family in with you, when they die, on the power of your sacrifice, right? I mean, this is the vision of what happens after death that jihadists believe. Now, can you find the occasional cynical operator or the mentally unwell person who's just functioning by a slightly different piece of software? Of course, right? You can find the person who doesn't believe it or had his doubts or reluctantly was goaded into becoming an attempted suicide bomber and failed, et cetera. But for the most part, what you get is when you listen to interviews of jihadists, when you bug their mosques and hear what they talk about behind closed doors when they think no one is listening, right? What you get is sincere confessions of religious belief, right? Every bit as sincere, apparently, as far more benign confessions of, an ordinary Christian who thinks that Jesus can hear their prayers, right? I mean, that is the difference with Islam. And there are several differences. I mean, this is, and I realize I'm giving you kind of a scattershot and an impressionistic account of my criticism here, but there are several ways in which we are misled in thinking that Islam is the same as any other major religion, right? I mean, obviously, the religions can't be the same because then there'd be no reason to be a member of one as opposed to another, right? I mean, there are differences. There are specific doctrines that are different. If you're a Christian, on some level, you have to believe that Jesus was divine, right? I mean, that's any serious Christian believes that as a minimum table stakes. Well, that's anathema under Islam. Jesus was not divine. It's explicitly, that would be polytheism to imagine that Jesus was divine, right? So. There's no negotiating that. So it's just a different point of view. But Islam is different in several specific ways. One is that it is its militancy. The expectation that the faith will be defended with force, right? And the faith will conquer the world. In this life, right? They're not just waiting around for the Messiah to come or for Jesus to come back and rectify things. No, there's this expectation of conquest, and that this is theologically distinct from the other religions, but it's also just historically distinct. I mean, just look at the career of the religion. I mean, from its founder on. I mean, Muhammad was not a hippie who got crucified, right? Muhammad was a warlord who fought in dozens of battles and won, right? I mean, so just imagine a religion born of a progenitor who is much more like Napoleon or Alexander the Great than he was like, Buddha, right? I mean, it's just a very different kind of DNA theologically, right? And a very different set of expectations. And the ideal is certainly not to be turning the other cheek, right? It's certainly not, the meek shall inherit the earth, right? That's not the ethos of Islam, and the problem we have worldwide, we've had it for decades and we'll have it for the rest of our lives, and our children and their children will also have this problem, is that if you honestly look at the Quran and the Hadith and the biography of the Prophet, and you look at it as a recipe for building a life, right? Which is what every believing Muslim must do. And then you look at the most grotesque example of theocratic barbarism, we witnessed in our lifetime, the Islamic State, right? And you ask yourself, well, what was Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi getting wrong about Islam? What were all these people who were migrating to Syria and Iraq, when the caliphate seemed to be real about 10 years ago? People dropping out of medical school in London and going to support the caliphate. What were they getting wrong, right? When they were taking sex slaves from the Yazidis by the thousands and crucifying the men and starving people on the slopes of a mountain there and burning people alive, or all manner of thought crime, right? And cutting the hands off of thieves. And what were they getting wrong about the religion, right? That is a very difficult question to answer. And honestly, there's no great answer coming from Islam, right? I mean, you can split a few hairs there, but this was a totally plausible version of the faith. Now, if you ask that question about any other faith, if you say, well, what are they getting wrong about Jainism here? What are they getting wrong about Buddhism? What are they getting wrong about the Anglican communion here, right? They're obviously getting a lot wrong. No one can say that this is a an honest way of connecting the dots of theology and practice in any of those other faiths, but you can say it for Islam, right? And you can say it of a group like Hamas. And honestly, you can stand with ISIS and criticize Hamas as being insufficiently committed to the project of jihad, right? Or and getting and cutting corners on their theology, right?
But surely there are Muslims, and I think they face a problem that's not dissimilar from the one we talked about earlier about putting your own game theoretic problem of you want to be a free rider if you can, and often that's your incentive. When you have groups within your faith that are eager to use violence and you're not, you're going to look complicit, and you are complicit. But we understand that complicity. For surely there are people who say, and I assume they mean it, but you can tell me if I'm wrong, that jihad is a spiritual battle, that the Islamic State, that Hamas, that the Muslim Brotherhood, that these radical groups are not true Muslims. They have corrupted the faith, and it's just they've gone rogue, and it would be unfair for you, Sam, or me, Russ, to lump them together. In fact, it's offensive, and this makes you an Islamophobe. How dare you imply that they're the same religion?
Right. Well, so half of that is understandable. Half of it's clearly dishonest, but it's all too common. I mean, so here's what's true here. What's true is that
I'm doing my best.
Yeah. What's true here is that most Muslims, in most places, most of the time, one had every reason to believe and certainly hope, have realized that they don't want to live the way jihadists and even Islamists, want all Muslims to live, right? I mean, they've got enough of a taste of modernity and secular rationality, whether they think of it in those terms or not. They know enough science. They know enough about democracy. They know enough about human rights. They have enough of a taste of life being worth living in this world that they want other things, right? And in this regard, they're the same as religious moderates in every other faith, right? I mean, there are ultra orthodox Jews that really care, what is spelled out in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. But most Jews worldwide don't want to live that way, and for good reason, in my view, right? So, genuine liberals among Muslims and genuine free thinkers, and I mean, all of that is to be encouraged and to be celebrated, and it is why we don't have a bigger problem than we have, right? But that's not, though. As with every other faith, that's evidence of the faith being and the doctrine and the scripture being effectively edited by everyone's disregard of it, right? It's not a new form of Christianity to decide that you really don't want to you don't want people who really believe in the power of prayer having too much responsibility in your society. You certainly don't want them flying your airplanes and trying to cure your kids' cancers, right? You want rational people who are secular, who are ruled by scientific principles and are disregarding the Bible for their important tasks. Most Christians in the West feel that way, and that's why most Christians in the West look back on medieval Christendom with amazement and horror, right? I mean, this is the Christians of the 14th century were not rational, the rational actors of a sort that we want to live side by side with, and for good reason. But that is a story of how Christianity has been winnowed and modified and moderated by its collision. It's multi-century collision with secular rationality and the norms of open societies, et cetera. Islam is suffering a collision now. It hasn't had the benefit of centuries. It has been isolated to a unique degree in recent centuries, and still is so. I mean, I think these data are a little old, but as of maybe 10, 15 years ago, it was true to say, and I assume it's probably still true to say now, that Spain, the country of Spain, translates more of the world's literature and learning into Spanish each year than the entire Arab world has translated into Arabic since the 7th century. Right? I mean, that's a picture of many things, but chief among them is of profound intellectual isolation. Right? Because we're talking about Spain. I mean, we're not talking about. I mean, that's not even a first tier translation project into Spanish, right? It's. I mean, at bottom, we're talking about the power of ideas, right? Ideas matter. I mean, beyond asteroid impacts and the activity of viruses that no one yet knows the name of, what we should care about and worry about are ideas, right? I mean, the power of bad ideas is much bigger and more consequential and alarming than the power of bad people. There's just not that many bad people. I'm not worried about the 1% of humanity that happen to be psychopaths. I mean, they're a problem, obviously, and they commit disproportionate harm because they get up every day and they're very busy and they do bad things. But the real problem we face is that we have lots of psychologically normal people, and even people who would, in other contexts, be extraordinarily good and inspiring people, believing ridiculous and divisive and dangerous things, and it's and they're doing it in contexts where these ideas have effectively become immune to criticism, and religion is the ultimate context where this gets achieved in more or less without friction, because there are taboos around criticizing religious ideas that are still observed even in secular culture, and this is obviously we play a very different language game in science and every other area where we let ideas collide, right? And that's we protect people from our incredulity in the face of their religious certainties, even in a secular context. I mean, I got my PhD in neuroscience, one of the smartest people in our lab, who really, she was a graduate student, but she was, she had kind of oversight over all of the kind of statistical methods we were using to analyze neuroimaging data, right? She was kind of the math head in this particular lab. She was also a fundamentalist Christian, right, who believed that evolution was a fiction, and that God created the earth more or less as described. And I think probably as recently as 4,000 years ago, right, or 6,000 years ago.
5,700. Yeah,
right. 4004 BC or something like that, according to certain evangelicals. This is what she believed, right? Now, no one. She managed to pass through a scientific education here at UCLA without anyone ever sitting her down and saying, "Listen, there's a lot of stuff you believe that really can't survive collision with the rest of what you believe over here scientifically." Right? And we know that evolution is real, and we know that the Earth is older than you think it is, and your church is not an authority on any of these things. And you have to get, you as an intellectual have a burden to get your beliefs to cohere, or at least to acknowledge to acknowledge this discordance that is just cognitively, inoperable, right? No one ever does that because it's taboo to do it. Again, even it's not just within the walls of a church, outside of the church, in the walls of the ivory tower. And so it is with Islam, right? And so it is with the belief that it must be at bottom a peaceful religion, because most Muslims, most of the time, certainly in the West, are peaceful people who just want to get along with their neighbors, right? It's wonderful that they are peaceful people who want to get along with their neighbors because they're human beings. It's not a surprise that they would want to live that way. But when you drill down on the articles of faith, you get a very different message. And that message is of consequence to anyone who wants to go down that rabbit hole. And again, this comes back to empathy. What is it like to be a person who really wants to understand what salvation is, right? What it means. How is it that you can live so as to escape the fires of hell if you believe in hell, right? What does God say on this subject? God is very clear in the pages of the Quran, right? He is not, and it's not the meek shall inherit the earth, right? It's that, the principal message of the Quran, and I invite all of your listeners to just read the book. This is not like the Bible that would take you a month and a half to read, cover to cover, if you were spending all day and night reading it, right? This is something you can read effectively in a weekend. And don't let anyone tell you that you can't read it if you can't read Arabic, right? Now, you can read the most plausible English translations of it, and you will absorb its central message. Its central message is not how important love is, or how important compassion is, or how it's important to avoid conflict at all costs. No, its basic message is that you should fear going to hell, right? And because this is the main problem of this life, how to avoid going to hell, you should fear and shun and revile all of those people who don't believe precisely what you need to believe to avoid going to hell. You should fear the unbeliever. You should shun him. You should never befriend him, right? And the Jew and the Christian are, they're not as bad as the polytheist. They're not as bad as the Hindu, but they're bad, and they need to be subjugated. They need to convert, or they need to pay the poll tax. And there's no world in which Muslims should be living alongside them with equal power. No, Muslims need to rule over them. That's the only way this world is supposed to be organized, and it's absolutely clear in the text, and it's clear in the biography of Muhammad and in his success in doing that. Right?
Well, yeah, but the thing I want to emphasize, and it's funny, you're saying these things, and they still make me uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But you're getting to me. And I think the way for those of us who find such clarity uncomfortable is to think about it in the following way. Tell me if this is fair to your perspective. There are Muslims who are peaceful. There are Muslims who reject the most fundamentalist interpretations of the Quran. There are ways to interpret the Quran that are less vivid than the description you just gave. But we know there are a lot of people who accept that because they act on it. And on October 7th, Hamas wasn't launching a normal military action. They deliberately killed civilians and enjoyed the fact that they were Jews and enjoyed taking them back, some of them alive, some of them dead, and glorifying their death. And in your most disturbing episode, the one about the bright line between good and evil, you catalog very painfully the number of people who believe, whether it's mainstream Islam, doesn't matter. There's a number, there are numerous, not like 5, not like 10, but many, many, many episodes where people murdered infidels in the name of their religion in the 20th and 21st centuries. It's hard for us to accept. You can see that. You say that we like to believe that other people are like us. Even anthropologists, professors of anthropology assume that no one could seriously take seriously the idea that there's a God in heaven. So I think I'll let you comment on that, but my next question, I'll give it to you now so you can roll it into your answer, is it doesn't matter what the percentage is. There's a significant number of people who are willing to kill in the name of God out of theological motivation. And and it's particularly relevant for Jews, but it's not just Jews. And it raises the question of what, because it's not just about the Jews, it's about the West. Coming back to where we started, what's the West possibly to do about this? I think about, I don't pay any attention to French politics. I know there's somebody named Marine Le Pen who doesn't like radical Islam. She just got the highest number of votes in their snap election. We don't know how she'll do this Sunday in the next round, but she probably will win. She could win, and let's say she does win. We know that Geert Wilders in the Netherlands has been very successful. There's the rise in the West right now of people who take your point of view, not most of the rest of your point of view, but this piece of it, and view Islam as radical Islam, at least, as an enemy. The problem is that they're not going to ban Islam, I don't think, in France. They're going to, Marine Le Pen says she wants to ban radical Islam. She wants to close radical mosques. She wants to deport people who don't want to live the way the French people live. Is it really possible to implement such a policy in an open society in today's West? It seems, I can't imagine what's going to happen. And after her election, there were riots and buildings were burned to the ground and windows were broken and looting took place because she's, quote, anti-Islam. This is the future, I think, of the West for a while, this battle. That's what I'm worrying about. It's very hard for me to say these things, but I've learned this from you. Am I right? Is this what you believe? And how's that going to play out?
Yeah, well, so let me address your discomfort here, because there are reasons why what I'm saying makes people uncomfortable, and why there's a reputational cost, frankly, for saying these things. And it's it's worth just specifying what a few of these are. I mean, there are kind of many layers to this, but I mean, one is just that you just pointed out that there are real bigots in every society, right? In the real racists, there are real xenophobes. There are people who just hate Muslims as people, because they hate all non-white immigrants as people, right? And this is their attitude politically and ethically, right? And so if those people happen to also hate Muslims as they do, they may superficially sound like they're saying some of the same things I'm saying about Islam and its threat to the West. And then there'll apparently be some kind of guilt by association, but because I seem to be echoing their sentiments. You have some crackpot racist preacher in Florida who decides to burn a Quran to prove that Islam isn't a religion of peace, and I seem to be standing alongside such a person in my critique now. So that's inconvenient. The thing to point out there is that bigotry and racism and xenophobia are bad things for people psychologically and for all of us socially, and they're not what we want in an open society, and they're not the core of any sane ethics, etc. And they're to be disavowed. So, and I say this, again, there's not even a hint of. So there are many things that are heaped in here by people on the left and by people who are worried about so-called Islamophobia to confuse matters, right? So there should be no logical implication of racism in anything I've said about Islam here. And this should be very easy to see. One, you should recognize that Islam is not a race, right? It's a set of ideas, right? This idea is now prevalent in 100 countries, right? There are at least 50 Muslim majority countries, but Islam is the fastest spreading religion on earth, and it's in at least 100 countries, right? So there's no race of Muslims, right? And I could become a Muslim now in 5 minutes just by converting, right? So this is just not. This is totally orthogonal to the question of race. And you can see that from the other side when I just told you that, some of my friends and some of the people I trust most on this issue are ex-Muslims, right? So people who are, born in countries like Egypt, et cetera, right? So if I were a racist against such people, well, then I would be just as racist against them as, any of the Muslims I'm apparently racist against, et cetera, right? So race is whenever you hear an allegation of racism on this topic, you know that someone is just not interacting with the actual criticism. And deeper still, I'm not even for the most part, I'm not talking about people. I'm talking about the power of ideas, right? I'm talking about ideas that can, to the degree to which they're believed, they have certain, logical, behavioral implications, right? If you really believe that dying under certain circumstances is the best thing that could possibly happen to you because it ushers in an eternity in paradise, not just for you, but for the people you care about most in this world after they die, well, then that has certain consequences, insofar as you actually believe that. And we see those consequences, and people talk about those consequences ad nauseum in jihadist circles, and we need only listen to what they say, right? And, here you encounter a double standard here, which should be really perplexing if it were not so widespread as that we just cease to notice it. But in every other context, we take people at their word, right? When again, to go back to Dylan Roof, right? Dylan Roof, the maniac racist who went in and killed, I think it was 9 black churchgoers in Charleston. You ask him why he did what he did, and you read his online rantings, and there's no mystery as to why he did what he did. He hated black people. He was a white supremacist, right? You say, why'd you do that? And he says, well, I hate black people. I think they're polluting our society, and I'm a white supremacist, right? I want a purely white society. No one takes a step back at that moment and says, well, does he really believe those things? I mean, is that just a cover for what was really going on here? Is this really just a story of economics at bottom? Was it lack of economic opportunity being expressed here? And this is we have a veneer of racist ideology that is masking the deeper causality here. Or did he really believe that he hated black people and they were destroying his society, and he wanted to make a political point to all of his fellow white supremacists who he agrees with, right? No one doubts that racists, real racists, when they tell you they're racists, have the actual courage of their convictions and are speaking honestly about what they believe, right? And even in a religious context, when you ask people, why is it that you go to mass every Sunday, right? And why do you say the rosary? And why do you teach your children what you teach them? And why do you force them to go to church when they don't want to, et cetera, et cetera? Why do you do these things? Well, I believe that Jesus is the Son of God. I believe that the Bible is a divinely inspired book. No one says, well, does she really believe those things? Couldn't this be just again, just economics forcing its way through into her experience in a way that's just totally unacknowledged and unconscious, and that's the level at which we have to engage this? No, people rather often believe what they say they believe. Now, again, there could be some daylight between professions of belief and actual, core, cognitive commitments that we want to, dignify as real beliefs. So, I'll grant you that. If 65% of Americans say they believe in Satan, which used to be the case, I don't know about recent polling on this issue. If that were true, so that's what they say, but do they when things go bump in the night, or when their kids get a weird look in their eye, what percentage of people really believe that Satan may be at work? Well, it's going to be less than 65%, but it's not nothing, right? Some people really do believe in Satan. And when you have a woman who, drowns half her family in a bathtub because she thinks they're possessed by Satan, right? Yes, you can. In many cases, you can ascribe mental illness to these people because that's what it takes to really believe in Satan. Really, really believe in Satan in most 21st century contexts now, often. But it's not so in the Muslim community throughout the developing world. When you're talking about jihadism, what does it take to believe that the Quran is the perfect word of the Creator of the universe, and that He's being honest about martyrdom as a real principle, right? And that death is an illusion, right? What does it take to believe that? Not much, right? That is the culture. That is what you get on mother's knee, right? That is just straight religion with these slight turns of political and terrestrial implication of what should you fight for, what should you and how should you fight for it, and what's a killing offense? Well, wait a minute, you're telling me that this woman burned the Quran? Can we get a mob together to beat this person to death on a sidewalk? Sure, we can. We can do that in any Muslim community in almost any city on earth, right? You can get a quorum of people who will do that, and it's not a mystery as to why. And there's absolutely nothing mysterious. I mean, if you believe that economics is the reason, or ordinary political concerns are the reason for jihadist behavior, then you have to be absolutely mystified as to why someone would drop out of medical school to join the ISIS, right? I mean, that has to be a confession of just stark mental illness, and then you scratch the surface on this person and you say, oh no, he's not mentally ill. In fact, he was the captain of a soccer team, right? He had a lot to live for. He's not this weird, person who's on some spectrum of psychopathology who just couldn't get his life together and in a desperate moment, booked a ticket to Syria. No, there are endless examples of high functioning people who are getting their degree in engineering or architecture, people who had wives and children that they were leaving behind, right? Or mothers with children who were going to marry the jihadist, who they fell in love with online, right? I mean, you have to believe that ISIS was acting as a bug light for the world's psychopaths and mentally unstable, people who were just frankly crazy, who could be lured there, and other evil people who were going to do evil of the same sort, regardless of the circumstance they found themselves in, right? Yes, they could go to Syria and do it to the Yazidis, but no, they were going to do it in the suburbs of Paris and Munich and Los Angeles anyway, right? Because these are bad people who are going to do bad things anyway. None of that's true. There's not a scintilla of evidence that any of that is true. What there's abundant evidence for is that psychologically normal people can be led to believe these things, right? People who would have otherwise become Buddhist meditators who would put themselves on. I mean, this is now to come back to me and my protestations of empathy, right? The reason why I feel like I have some sense of this is that in my 20s, I did something rather extreme, right? I dropped out of Stanford and spent a tremendous amount of time studying meditation in Asia and on silent retreat, right? And I spent, something like a year and a half in silence in my 20s, right? And it was, in increments of 1 week to 3 months long, right? And in a period of maybe 4 or 5 years, and that was on the wings of some very specific beliefs, right? That meditation was an incredibly powerful tool for exploring consciousness, and that there was real spiritual work to be done in doing that, and that self-transcendence is a real possibility psychologically, which is the self, the ego, as we all of us come to know it in our experience, by default is an illusion, right? And you can transcend this illusion and feel much better in your own skin moment to moment as a conscious being. I felt all of that was true, and based on certain experiences I had both in meditation and with psychedelics, and in my reading of the literature, and it just so happened that I was reading, Eastern philosophy and Buddhism especially, but what would have happened if I had been reading the Quran, right? What would have happened if all of my spiritual aspirations had been channeled in the direction of Islam, and Muhammad had been my example of the best possible life, right? I could have done what John Walker Lind did. I mean, John Walker Lind was, patient zero in the West for this specific bacillus. In the immediate aftermath of September 11th, we went into Afghanistan. We find this white guy from Marin County in a hole, being flooded with his fellow Taliban fighters. And we'd drag him out of there and, try him and put him in prison. And apparently now he's out of prison. I think he got out in 2022, still believing everything he believed to get him into that hole in the first place. He's an Islamist at minimum. I mean, he hasn't disavowed anything. He's a proto-jihadist. He's a white guy like me, grown up in relative privilege, and you just had his spiritual aspirations channeled in the direction of a sincere commitment to the root texts and foundational examples to be found within the tradition of Islam, right? I know what that's like. I just know it under a different aegis and by a different logic, right? I know what it's like to stay up all night, in darkness, sitting in the, under a tree, focused on nothing but your core spiritual concerns, right? In this life, letting go of everything else, any other ambition in life, but to break through to profundity, right? And I know that in a Buddhist context and a kind of a yoga context and in a context that committed me to, it could have committed me to other beliefs that I don't happen to hold and things about which I'm agnostic because I'm, again, I have enough of a grounding in science to be skeptical about things like, rebirth and karma and all that stuff that you get in Buddhism. I'm not saying that Buddhism is perfect temple of rationality, but what you don't get is a commitment to jihad, right, in any of those other traditions, right? And you can readily get that if you go deep with Islam. And the fact that most Muslims, most of the time, haven't done that is a very good thing. But what we need to engineer within the Muslim world, and we really can't engineer it, we just have to sort of wait for it to happen because we can't engineer it from outside. But what we need to have happen in the Muslim world is a proper civil war of ideas, and I think several actual civil wars that marginalize jihadism and Islamism as social phenomenon, right? And what we need to do from outside of the Muslim world as, infidels who are on collision course with jihadism and Islamism is win wars against jihadism, and political wars against Islamism. We have to, Hamas has to be destroyed, right? That's just a fact. There's no good outcome with Sinwar ambling out of the rubble saying, look, I'm still here. We won. We've lived to fight another day, and we're going to do October 7th again and again. You just watch, right? That is not the outcome.
Which is people have said.
Yeah.
So I think part of go ahead, finish.
No. You let me rave for quite some time there. I think you know what I think on this issue, but it's just let's keep going. Ask me anything you want.
So I think there are two things that are difficult about that viewpoint, and part of my discomfort's the liberal discomfort of using liberal in the 19th century sense, the liberal discomfort of tolerance and
right.
But certainly taking people at their word is part of that tolerance, and I think you're right that we should respect what people say, especially when they act accordingly. That's the strangest, most disturbing part of this moment for me. They don't hide it. Hamas doesn't hide it. They did amend their charter. Their charter is not quite as filled with Jew hatred as it was originally. I think it was amended in 2017. Yeah. But certainly their actions don't suggest they've amended it. They don't want to live side by side with the Jewish state. So what makes me uncomfortable first is the idea that, yes, I don't like to think that human beings are that way, but I do think you have to take it seriously. But I think the risk that many of us from a Western perspective feel, it's less common here, I think, in the Middle East generally, but for those of us who were marinated in an American culture and have moved here, I'm agnostic about how many Palestinians accept Hamas's charter agenda. I'm agnostic about what polling shows. Polling shows that 60 to 70% support, I think if I got it right, still support October 7th, but it's a quite large difference between the West Bank and Gaza, by the way. It's much higher in the West Bank and it's lower in Gaza because they're living with the consequences of it. And a number of people feel like you do, that we got to get rid of this Sinwar guy, period, before we can prosper. It's not just that he's filled with Jew hatred and acts on it. It's that he has no respect for his neighbors, his fellow citizens who he has dominion over. He steals their food, steals their money, and uses it for his own projects rather than to make life better for their people. So I like the idea that there are a lot of people in Gaza who would like to live a better life and who do not have jihad at the center of their being. But if I'm not careful, I might come to believe that that's not the case. And that would justify what I think the worst enemies of Israel see as how they see Israel. We're not genocidal. We could have destroyed Gaza in a weekend. We could have killed all 2 million effortlessly. They have no defenses. We would be victimized by world opinion, but we're victimized anyway by a good chunk of it. And I say this over and over again. It's biased information. I understand that, listeners. But, I talk to my students every day, and they go into Gaza. Our army is filled with my students, and they go up north to Lebanon. And in their mind, they live by a code of protecting as many Gazan civilians as possible. They have no desire to kill innocent civilians. They have orders to kill people carrying guns, and they have orders to kill people who are in certain places where they've been told to leave, but they have no interest in gunning down innocent people, and it would break them as human beings, and I don't want my children or my children's children or my neighbor's children to be those people. And my worry is that if we go to war against this idea of radical Islam, we meaning Israel and the West, we will do things that will be very destructive of our humanity, which of course all wars are. World War II, which most people would say the Nazis were worth defeating, or the Japanese military was worth defeating. We did horrible things in the name of that mission. And we did them at the time. I don't know if we'd still do them that way. I think we'd have trouble with it now, maybe. But we did it effortlessly, We've talked about it before. Dropping the atomic bomb does terrible things, but we firebombed Tokyo before that and killed 100,000 people in a night. We did it to Dresden. Meaning the West, the Allies. So I think the challenge for the West is that we're between two very unpleasant choices. One is we have a tolerance of the other that is admirable and beautiful. And it comes at a price. And the alternative is to be vigilant. The price of liberty is eternal vigilance. And since it's hard to distinguish between the peaceful Muslim and the radical one, I think most Westerners are going to struggle to make the choices that you're suggesting we might think about taking. And I don't see how this is going to end particularly well. I like to quote Hilaire Belloc every once in a while in his poem. I think it's called Pacifism. Pale Ebenezer thought it wrong to fight, but Roaring Bill, who killed him, thought it right. And most of us in the West are pacifists. In Israel, we don't have a choice. When they come across the border and rape your women and kidnap your children, you fight. But most of the West doesn't feel like it wants to fight. And they're not going to want to kill, deport, and shame people who are innocent. It bothers us, just like it bothers us to kill innocent Gazans here in Israel. So how is this going to turn out well? How's that intellectual fight that you're talking about? How are we going to win this? A lot of people say, it's easy. We did the same thing with Nazism. You go in and you just denazify them. So we just need to have Gaza run by people who don't have these horrible textbooks that talk about how great it is to kill Jews and how Israel's evil, and we'll de-radicalize them. Well, that's not going to, it's just not a plausible strategy to me. It might be effective. I just don't see it happening. So where do we go from here? What do we do day to day besides tell the truth, which I'm a big fan of, and you've convinced me that we should be more honest about some of the evil in the world, while being careful to distinguish between the dark, ugly parts of all religions and the not dark parts of religions. How do we move? How do we go forward?
Yeah, well, it's a hard question. I mean, there's a needle that needs to be threaded here, or a high wire that we are on that we don't want to fall off. And you've pointed to some of the directions where we might topple. I mean, we have to be aware of the fact that in responding to violence, we run the risk of brutalizing ourselves. I mean, which is to say, being made brutal by our own response. And to guard against that is an enormous priority for us ethically. I mean, we don't want to lose what we are right to defend in civilization in the act of defending it. Right? I mean, there is a moral high ground. We are on it. We want to stay on it. Right? And that can be hard to do. And I think, when you look back at the details of how we fought World War II, which, I think everyone acknowledges was a necessary war and we were on the right side of it. I don't think we could fight it that way again, and probably shouldn't fight it that way again. I mean, it's more military history than I know to get into the details of parsing just what was effective and what wasn't there in terms of killing non-combatants in Dresden and Tokyo and elsewhere. But one can imagine that much of it was not necessary and effective, and that it was gratuitous and just sheerly grotesque and horrible from an ethical point of view, and that we wouldn't do it again in hindsight. Which is to say, we were wrong to do it at the time. But notwithstanding the fact that Nazi Germany was really a kind of and Imperial Japan were both their own versions of a kind of consummate evil that we were right to destroy. Right? I mean, and all these people who say you can't bomb an idea. Well, you can pretty effectively bomb an idea. I mean, look what there's not much real Nazism and real, suicidal devotion to the Emperor of Japan left, and that's a good thing. And force was the answer to that problem. And the first thing to bracket this conversation with is an acknowledgement that pacifism, as much as it seems to have real spiritual bona fides, is not an ethical position that is easy to defend. I mean, when Gandhi was asked, I mean, Orwell wrote about this quite sneeringly. When Gandhi was asked, what the Jews of Europe should do in the face of the Third Reich, he said that they should have walked willingly into the gas chambers so as to arouse the rest of the world to arouse the conscience of the rest of the world. But that demands the follow-up question, which is, what is the rest of the world to do with their aroused consciences if they're also pacifists, right? I mean, what pacifism is a willingness to let the thugs inherit the earth, right? If you're willing to let your wife and children be raped and decapitated in front of your eyes, and you're not going to lift a finger to protect them because you're a pacifist, yes, maybe you have not got your hands dirty on one level, but you represent a kind of ethical singularity on another, and that's an event horizon no one should want to disappear through, right? I mean, it's a geopolitically, politically, interpersonally, it's a kind of fanaticism and a delusion to think that it's an adequate response to the evils that we can confront in this world. And it only worked for Gandhi in the Indian context because he had a sufficiently civilized enemy in the British, right? It would not have worked against the Nazis in India, right? Who were just going to, kill everyone who lined up to be killed. And that's the kind of enemy we face. It's not. We just have to be aware of the asymmetries here, which are as real and as surprising as some kind of bizarre cartoon. I mean, it sounds like a cartoon. It sounds dishonest. It sounds like wartime propaganda for me to say that if the Palestinians just laid down their arms, there would be peace in the Middle East, whether in a one-state solution or a two-state solution. If the Palestinians were pacifists, this problem would be over, right? That sounds like it's just too simple, but it's true, right? Modulo a couple of right-wing fanatics in Israel who can say some crazy things and they represent almost nobody, there would be peace in the Middle East. If the Jews laid down their arms, there would be a genocide, right? That's not mere speculation. That is what Hamas has said. That's what Hezbollah has said. That's what the Islamic Republic of Iran has said. And it's what Hamas and Hezbollah to some degree have attempted, right? It's not just a modern species of political derangement. They have the Hadith to back them up, right? And they have the example of Muhammad in various collisions with Jews to back them up, right? I mean, it's not, the Hadith of the trees and stones, which was in the original charter of Hamas.
Explain what that is.
I mean, it's Islamic prophecy that the day of judgment, when the day of judgment comes, the very earth will cry out against the Jews. The trees and the stones will cry, will with their mouths will cry out. There's a Jew behind. Oh, Muslim, there's a Jew behind me. Come kill him. Right. I mean, this is a fulfillment of Islamic eschatology, right? The murder of the Jews by the triumphal Muslims at that moment in history, right? Now it's happening too early. If you're going to be a member of ISIS or the Islamic State, the ultra hardcore, you're going to look at what Hamas is doing and say, you're doing it too early, guys. This is not the moment to be killing the Jews, right? This is the moment for to form the caliphate and to, I mean, you got things out of order. You're not good enough scholars of all of this, right? And if we could get our hands on you, we might want to cut your heads off as apostates, right? So there's schisms among jihadists, right? But the basic message is no. There's no way of living. You can't live in Israel, with the third holiest site for Islam, ruled by Jews and Jewish Copts, right? This is anathema theologically, right? But this sounds like a cartoon. To point out these asymmetries sounds cartoonish, but they're all too real. I mean, so Hamas is using its own civilian population as human shields now to diminishing effect, but it is in fact true that your college students who are fighting this war are reluctant to kill innocent Palestinian non-combatants if they can possibly avoid it, right? This is not part of their aspiration to be, shooting through the bodies of children to get at Hamas, right? And Hamas knows this. It's cynically, they know that they're in a conflict with people whose ethical scruples are much more finely tuned than their own, who actually care about their own children, that is, not killing them, more than the Palestinian leadership cares about them, right? I'm talking about Palestinian children, right? To say nothing of the human shields they're using that are hostages, right? Now just try to reverse this. Imagine those poor people on a kibbutz, right? I mean, imagine the IDF had been there at the southern border with Gaza on October 7th and had decided in defending itself against Hamas at that moment, had decided to use women and children in those various kibbutzes as human shields, right? Imagine there had been IDF soldiers at the Nova Music Festival deciding to use teenage revelers as human shields against Hamas, right? I mean, first of all, it's unthinkable that that decision would be made. I mean, that's just simply not the culture and psychology of anyone in Israel to do such a thing. I mean, that's a moral horror to even contemplate that they would do that. But just imagine the effect of doing it. Imagine the minds of the Hamas fighters with their assault weapons confronting IDF soldiers who are like laying their barrels on the shoulders of children to fight back, right? As the Jewish children, right? As though that could possibly work, right? Hamas, whose purpose was to kill non-combatants, right? Again, as I said this in that podcast, this is a Monty Python sketch in which all the Jews die, right? This is absolutely absurd to think about. And the magnitude of its absurdity should alert us to just how uneven this moral landscape is, right? I mean, the place where the Jews are standing is worlds apart ethically from where Hamas is standing and where any sympathizer with Hamas among the Palestinians is standing. It's a completely different moral project. It's a completely different vision of the value of human life. Everything is upside down, and we have to admit this, right? These are not analogous cultures, right? And this sounds like a cartoon. This sounds like wartime propaganda where I'm demonizing the other, right? It's total bullshit, right? I'm empathizing with the other. I understand what they think is true about the moral order of the universe. They think death is not real, right? And this is many religious people think death is not real, right? But they think some very specific things around the act of dying and what needs to be done in life while alive. So certainly to defend the one true faith against its attackers, right? And this extends even to the lowly cartoonists, right? It's completely valid to risk your life for the privilege of killing a cartoonist who has defamed the prophet in Paris, right? This is a project that can be justified, right? And that's a problem not just for the Jews and not just for Israel. It's a problem for the entire world. It's a problem for open societies. And above all, moderate Muslims, liberal Muslims, by the hundreds of millions, need to recognize this and join us. I mean, the most toxic thing here is for so-called moderate Muslims, Muslims who consider themselves to be quite far away from Hamas, to reflexively defend their co-religionists even when they're acting like psychopaths, right? And this is what we have seen again and again in all of our conflict with the Muslim world. I mean, it's not just Israel and Hamas and Hezbollah, and this is America in wherever it has had to deal with any Muslim population in any of its wars or in any of its local skirmishes or anywhere. What you find are Muslims, other Muslims, just because they're co-religionists, no matter how sociopathic their behavior, that has to stop. Right? That's the bright line that can't be crossed. We need Muslims who are committed to free and ethical and tolerant lives in open societies to totally disavow all the needless chaos and mayhem and suffering being created by jihadism and fanatical commitments to theocracy within their faith.
So let me say two things against that perspective. A lot of people in the aftermath of 9/11 said that no Muslims in America spoke out against it. Many did. And they weren't easy to find.
Some did, yeah.
Yeah, and they weren't covered by it. It's not like how do you know when they could? How many times do you have to disavow it? Do you have to march every Sunday and say we disavow it?
But speaking out, but there's two types of speaking out. You can speak out with lies. You can say this has nothing to do with Islam. This is just like the Christians murdering abortionists, right? Like the people who spoke out against 9/11, right, and said, well, this has got nothing to do with our faith, and then immediately pivoted to what about all the abortionists killed by Christians, right? And the last time that happened was like in 1986, right? That was a tissue of lies and obfuscations, and when you drill down on that, it can often become pretty sinister. Again, coming back to an organization like the Council of American Islamic Relations, right, which is stealth Islamism, right? I mean, it had explicit ties to the Muslim Brotherhood. Some of the people associated with it actually, fund terrorism. I mean, like, you drill down on these organizations, and you often find something quite sinister. And then this goes back to the money that Qatar is lavishing, on all of our institutions, right? Qatar shares the theology of the Muslim Brotherhood, right? This is not. They're committed. They might not be jihadists of the Al Qaeda sort, right? But they are Islamists, right? They're committed to the same project, but by another means, right? They want they want the world to live under Sharia law, right? They want, at the end of the day, right, perhaps with a few niceties, thrown in, they want to live in a world where homosexuality is a killing offense, right? It's like this is it's a very different vision of life, right? And so what you often have in an American context and in a Western context, in the UK, you have people like people who have very prominent platforms. Someone like Mehdi Hassan, right? The pseudo journalist who has a background as an Islamist. I mean, you can find Mehdi Hassan talking about how non-Muslims, live scarcely better than apes and pigs, right? I mean, like, he was a religious fanatic at one point. I think he's since disavowed it, but he is someone who will just dance around the topic of just playing hide the ball with the articles of faith endlessly and demonize anyone like me as a bigot and as an Islamophobe. Anyone like me who's actually drawing a straight line between actual doctrines and behavior we see in the world. He will just say this is bigotry, this is racism, right? It's not, right? And what you see in that bad faith dance is someone who is, for reasons that might vary depending on who you're talking about, you're seeing someone who is playing a very different political game that's not honest, right? It's not actually it's not doing the thing that I'm saying is actually necessary, which is, listen, we're Muslim, but we acknowledge that there are parts of the doctrine that no modern Muslim should take seriously, right? And that's a hard thing to do theologically, right?
Well,
it's
a hard thing to, but it's a hard thing to do practically too, because you're dealing with again, people willing to use violence, which makes it so much harder.
Yeah. That's why ex-Muslims are so brave.
Yeah, and to march on a Sunday in London in a parade called "Not in My Name," which hasn't happened, would be nice. Mm. And I'm not sure why it doesn't happen. It could be because, meaning not October 7th did not happen in our name, but it could be because they don't feel that way, or it could be because they're afraid to come out and publicly and do that. And I understand it. And I also understand the theological part. I mean, there are many things. Again, being a religious Jew, there are many things that ultra-Orthodox Jews believe, or more importantly do, that I think are not consistent with Judaism as I see it. Mm. But I'm loath to, we got enough troubles. And I think probably Muslims feel similarly, and I empathize with them, that it's hard to critique your fellow travelers because it's hard. But I want to say something else.
Actually, I just want to add one thing, Russ, there, because I think it's important. I think it really is necessary for Jews and for Israel politically to kind of break the spell of the ultra-Orthodox and the religious, the fanatical religious justification for the settlements, etc. Like, that part of Israeli politics is not at all helpful. I mean, you just get one person, in at some periphery to power, saying, talking about Amalek and the biblical justification for turning Gaza into a parking lot. And it can make it seem like there now is some kind of ethical religious parity between the two sides. Like they have their extremists, we have our extremists.
I have no problem.
Yeah.
I have no problem critiquing those viewpoints. I get it.
Yeah.
And I would add, by the way, that I have no problem critiquing their actions. Their unwillingness to serve in the army, for example, right now. Some of it's political posturing, but some of it, I think, is a misapplication of Jewish theology.
Yeah.
But that's a subject for another time. I want to add one more thing, though, that I think is important and get your reaction, which is, again, it's a bleak picture you're painting. I want to give a slightly rosier, cheerier vision, which is here in Israel, the 7 million Jews live alongside 2 million Arab Israeli citizens. There are another 2 million Arabs in Gaza and another 2 million plus on the West Bank. But there's 2 million Arabs who are mostly Muslim. There's some are Christian, but mostly Muslim, who live within the borders of Israel, of old Israel, what's so-called inside the Green Line. And it's an uneasy relationship at times. In 2021, when Israel and Gaza had what is now could only be called a dust-up after what we're seeing now, but many Israeli Arabs within the borders rioted and showed solidarity with Gaza. We've seen none of that this time around. And more than that, there are a number of Arabs who I think, well, I'll say it this way, it's pretty clear to me that if they had to choose between living under Hamas, a theocratic thugocracy that hates Jews and is eager to exterminate them, versus living under the Zionist entity as they do now, they will choose the Zionist entity, and they're happy to do so. And they're dispersed. Some of them are separate in towns that we don't go in, but many of them are my doctors and pharmacists and cab drivers, and I encounter them here in the city, in the streets of Jerusalem, fairly often. And we get along. And they don't have any of that Islamic, I don't think they have any of that Islamic, well, I don't know if they have some Islamism at their heart, but they don't have any jihad, at least publicly. And I don't feel it in any way. So maybe it's not as viral as you worry, and that it could be different.
Well, it's viral. It is as viral as I worry, but it does go in both directions. I mean, rationality is also viral, and I mean the basis for hope here really is that we're just talking about ideas, and people can change their minds, and more important, every child comes into this world knowing nothing, right? So this could all be accomplished in a generation. You just teach the next generation that we have this totally pluralistic, non-sectarian wealth of human wisdom to learn from, and there's religious tribalism is insane, and we should all just take the best ideas and talk about them freely in the spirit of tolerance and creativity and reason, and it would be accomplished. 30 years from now, we would have none of these problems, right? If we could affect that, but obviously that we can't do that. But the point is, people's minds can change, and I think there are some levers, some pretty long levers that we need to get our hands around and pull as hard as we can to accomplish that. One is to make the secular, pluralistic, open world better and better, right? It should be better and better to live in Tel Aviv, right? It should be so obviously better that it as to be unignorable. Like the worst life in Tel Aviv has to be so much better than the best life in any of the Arab capitals of under a theocracy, that, that's the commercial you want to run. On the other side, we need to kill jihadists, right? I mean, when someone raises their hand and says, I love death more than you love life, we should oblige them, right? I mean, like we are at war with, and this is not just Israel. Again, there are situations that have nothing to do with the West. They have nothing to do with Jews. That we're talking about. You're talking about Nigeria with Boko Haram using children as suicide bombers, right? Boko Haram needs to be defeated, right? These guys need to die. Like, this is a zombie movie. This is not a normal conflict. We're talking about people kidnapping children and turning them into bombs, right? And they have a religious justification for it, right? And we're talking about Westerners who sympathize with this. We need to win against jihadism. Every Muslim needs to be able to look at the jihadist project and understand that in the 21st century, it is just synonymous with failure. It has to be just relentlessly proven how unsexy it is to be a jihadist. And what was so alarming about the Islamic State is for a moment there, it looked pretty sexy, right? I mean, they would just roll into town and everyone would give way in front of them, right? I mean, they would say, like, you could think you were basically going to be a spiritual James Bond if you got with the jihadist project there for a moment. And to some significant degree, that's still true in various pockets of the Muslim world. I mean, it could seem like the best thing going, and it's going to seem credible if Sinwar stands on top of a pile of rubble and says they didn't do anything to us, right? Our martyrs are in paradise, and we're still standing, right? That's not going to be good. And I mean, granted, it could be worse. It could be, there are more triumphal versions of that, but I really think it should be clear to everyone that the most obnoxious jihadist projects have to be discredited through force, right? And Hamas is certainly one of those at the moment in the aftermath of October 7th.
My guest today has been Sam Harris. Sam, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Thank you, Russ. Great to talk to you.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.